All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you are. I believe today we have a lot of Canadians as attendees. I'm your moderator, radio and TV personality, Rob Pagetto, in Toronto, where we're finding we're in the middle of a heat wave with a lot of thunderstorms. And I think that's crossing right through Detroit, where Deborah R. Richardson is, and Brian's in Ontario as well. So lots going on. Today, the webinar will reveal the results from our 2024 Global Research Survey on accounts payable automation, identifying key trends over 5 years of compiled research. Now, our expert panel will discuss the current state of accounts payable automation and the key challenges to automating and where automation is providing the greatest results. They're also going to discuss research findings, including the key challenges caused by manual processing and the impact they have on the overall efficiency of the AP function. Let's meet our panelists. Brian Veloso, SAP Concur. Brian, tell us where you are and a little about yourself, please.
I am as well in Toronto. So we, like you, in the heat wave, and then we got a crazy storm this morning. So very nice to meet everyone here virtually. So Brian Veloso, I'm the managing director at SAP Concur. I've been with the organization now for about 19 years. So I've had an opportunity to speak to maybe many of you, but organizations of all sizes, just kind of understanding what their challenges are and figuring out how our solutions can help them ultimately achieve their business outcomes that they're looking for. So a pleasure to be on the call today.
Welcome aboard, Brian. Deborah R. Richardson, we've worked in the last, I would say, 8 months quite often. You represent yourself and also with Eiffel. Tell us about you, and I believe you're in Detroit, as I mentioned earlier.
I am in Detroit, and we keep getting thunderstorms and a heat wave. And when it gets hot in Detroit, we're not used to that hot weather. We just stay in the house until it cools off again. So there you go. But I am an IFOL educational trainer, and I'm also a certified fraud examiner. Many years of experience in accounts payable and also with a focus on the vendor management space. And so I work a lot with training on both topics, and I also really kind of focus on how you can use tools to prevent fraud, fines, and just overall bad data in your accounting system.
Fantastic. All right, well, let's get to it because we only have about 40 minutes. We have 3 questions for attendees, but we also have some research, as I mentioned earlier, that Brian and Deborah will chime in on. So let's start off with our first question to our attendees, and you'll be easily able to answer this. Do you use technology for data extractions and input from invoices? Yes or no? Very simple. You got a 50-50 chance here when you think of the days in school where you're like, I don't know. Once we get some more information as to what our attendees prefer, we'll have you guys discuss it. But it's been interesting when we talk about fraud, Brian. Like it's relevant everywhere.
Absolutely. You know what? It's funny. I've had the opportunity to speak to so many different organizations, and when I speak to CFOs, the things that are top of mind to them is always controlling costs and getting better visibility. And when I ask those questions, it usually then relates back to fraud. And I know, Deborah, fraud is very near and dear to your heart, but it's a reality for organizations, especially when we are in the times that we have right now with economic restraints. All that organizations have the ability to do to drive more profitability is to figure out a way to reduce costs. And a way to do so is to detect fraud. But the way to go do that is they need technology to help them go do so, because they can't just continue to throw bodies at the problem.
All right, so I know we have, again, a lot of Canadian attendees, and looks like 73% of you are yes and 27% are no. Deborah, what do you think about that? Does that seem like the norm?
Well, that is very promising. It's a little bit higher than what we saw on the accounts payable automation survey, but that's great because having that automation means you have less of the challenges that we're going to talk about from not having that automation.
Wonderful. Brian, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm excited about talking about the actual technology. So hold tight, because you can probably see it in my face. I want to get into the technology and tell them how they can solve their problems, but I will temper myself.
You're a techie. I love it. So let's go with that. We asked participants if they are using technology for data extractions and input from invoices. And overall, 61% said they are manually entering this data, and 39% said they have automated this process. And in Canada, it was 54% manual versus 46 automated. Brian, over to you.
I'm surprised that the number is actually that high based on the organizations that I speak to. So when I look at OCR technology, I look at AI, I look at machine learning. When it comes to what tool to implement within an organization, there's no right answer. What I always tell organizations is that grab any combination of technology that's going to allow to bring automation to your AP and your finance department. So when we start talking about things like OCR, I think it's important to kind of give an example as to what that is. That stands for optical character recognition. So if you think about it, every single expense report and every single payment request, and what I mean by a payment request is when an invoice comes in, a payment request in one way, shape, or form is being created to pay that vendor. They all have required fields that need to be captured. So if you look at an expense report as an example, at minimum, you need the date, you need the location, you need the dollar amount, and you need the expense type, because that gives you everything you need from a compliance standpoint. OCR automates the extract of that data from the receipt or the invoice and pre-populates the expense report or the payment request. So the big benefit there is that it's less manual entry and more accuracy. So that's OCR. Now, where AI is powerful is because it allows you to capture, process, and analyze large quantities of information in a very short period of time. So again, when we look at that in action, if we look at all three technologies in action, I'll give you an example with our Concur Invoice solution. So invoices pass through two types of technology. The first is OCR, as I described to you. And the second is what we call Text Tractor, which is like an automated templating tool. So there's the OCR component of it. AI then looks at that technology that's coming back from those two solutions, and it's looking at what the highest level of accuracy is, and then it's presenting that to the end user. Now, based on the end user validating that information, making any changes, the machine learning now is being used to improve the original technology that produced the data to begin with. So when you think about it, a combination of all the technologies is the best case scenario, but just introducing any technology that creates automation is a step forward for any finance organization.
Deborah, is this a process you believe more companies should be focusing their efforts on?
Oh, absolutely. Automating data extraction is not only avoiding errors, but also it could be used to compare information, right, that you have on file to catch fraud or catch critical changes. And so I'm going to tell a quick story, but I once had a very frustrated AP team member reach out to me and ask me if she should be responsible for finding like changes on invoices just because she was handling or posting or entering the invoice. And in this case, it was a change of banking. And so the expectation was that, you know, as she's processing these stacks of invoices manually, she's supposed to find, right, that change in banking. Well, of course you can't do that. But with automation, it can, right, per Brian's great explanation, using OCR, extract that information, and then use it to compare what's already on file, right? Say remittance address or banking information, and not that you should automatically change it, right? You should definitely go through your normal process for updates, but at least you know that there is a change and you can reach out to the vendor and use your normal process. The other thing I like about that too, and this is more so on the fraud side, it could also tell, right, if that invoice, maybe the one that had the change, came from a different email address than what their or where their normal invoice come from. And so now you have a red flag for fraud. So definitely having automating that process and including AI in there is a definite benefit for companies.
Now, what are some of those challenges that arise from manual entry? Give us a few examples of that.
Yeah, well, the biggest one is just the fact that you have errors. You can't, the human, right, can't see those changes like I was just talking about. And it gets very frustrating, and it also gets very stressful to the AP team. And as a matter of fact, one of the questions on the report or the survey was about what are some of the core issues. And the biggest one, or the one with the highest percentage, was the stress on the AP team. And then the second highest was damaged vendor and supplier relationship. Of course, because if you have issues, if you have errors, the AP team is stressed. Now, the processing of vendor invoices, right, can take longer, and then that's going to make the payments take longer, and that's going to damage the suppliers, the relationship between the company and the supplier.
It's almost like a wildfire. It starts here and just spreads.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to our next question for our attendees. What best describes the current state of automation in your AP function? Is it A, none, B, partial, C, mostly, or D, fully automated?
Now, if there are a lot of Canadians on this call, I expect this to be answered honestly.
I like that.
There. I'm out there, people. I'm speaking to your organizations. I know a little bit.
Well, speaking of Canadians, big game, big hockey game tonight.
Yes.
Our only Canadian team in a long time taking on the Panthers. Deb, are you rooting for the Panthers?
Okay, so I don't know what you're talking about. Well, so I don't follow hockey. I'm a professional football girl here, and with the season that the Lions had this past season or this past year, I'm just going for it again next year, or this new season started in August. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think we all are. Should be interesting. All right. So again, what best describes the state of automation in your AP function? 11% said no automation. 72%, a big number, said partial automation. 17% mostly automated, and 0 fully automated. Deborah, I'm going to start off with you. Is it realistic that companies should be aiming to fully automated accounts payable processes?
Well, in my experience, I don't know that anyone can get to 100%. It would be nice, maybe to get the one, because there's always going to be circumstances like new vendors that haven't been set up yet, and some other factors. Now, maybe, right, you can get there, but in my experience, you can get close. So I was in my last position as a practitioner, I was with a Fortune 15 company. And even with all of the automation tools that we had at our disposal and implementing those, we still could get to only 94% automation. But hey, that was years ago. Maybe we can get closer now with advances in automation, but I would really be surprised if it were 100%, like 100% of the time.
Brian, as the MD of SAP Concur Canada, can you tell us how you define a fully automated AP process?
Well, I love that Deborah described it as 100%. So now I feel like I can't say that you can get to 100% perfectly. So maybe I'll digress a little bit.
99.9.
99.9. So actually, you know what? Before I define what fully automated AP process is, I think it's a good moment in time to kind of define what no automation and partial automation look like, because that a lot of people said that partial is where they were at, and there was a lot of people with no automation as well too. I think the other thing that's important too is to remember that the AP function is more than just managing invoices. I know we're talking a lot about invoices, but they have so much more responsibility. If you think about the average operating costs within an organization, 65% of that flows through the AP team. About 10% of that is usually around expense reports. 55% of that is everything else, which typically falls onto an invoice. So in order to talk about fully automated, let's talk about what the average process for an organization is. So if you think about one expense report, I'm just going to walk through one expense report. So here's what that process looks like. It starts off with a relatively unhappy employee. And why the employee is unhappy is that they need to fill out an Excel spreadsheet that was likely created by finance, who has an accounting background. And they are waiting until the end of the month, grabbing all of their receipts, their confirmations, corporate card transactions, and they're putting it into this document. Then what's happening is they're passing it on over to their manager, and their manager is equally upset because they hired those employees and know that they don't have an accounting background. So they're now asking questions. They have some questions about the expenses. They have some questions about how it was coded into the expense report. And maybe it's touching another approver before ultimately it's rubber stamped, it's made its way to finance. Now, by the time it makes its way to finance, there has already been a phone call from the employee to the finance department saying, "Where's my money?" Right? I'm looking at Deborah because Deborah's validating all this for me. And that's the reality of the situation. So you've got an unhappy finance team that now knows that they have an employee and managers who didn't have maybe a background in accounting, who have filed these expense reports that account for 10% of the operating expenses for an organization. So what are they doing? They're auditing and fully reconciling those expense reports like they were the ones who actually wrote it. It's extremely time consuming. And that's an example of one expense report. Now, where partial automation comes into play, a lot of organizations have taken that Excel spreadsheet and instead of being printed off, it's now emailed to finance. That's what they consider partial automation. It's just the fact that it's not a piece of paper flowing through the organization anymore. That's one expense report. If you think about the vendor invoices now, on average, if you look at one expense report, for every one expense report, there's 10 to 20 invoices that come in. And it starts off with a relatively unhappy supplier. Now, they were happy when you bought something from them, but now they know that invoice needs to flow through the organization before they're ultimately paid for the services that they render. So you've got a similar situation with regards to the expense report. It's going through the buyer who has to maybe fill out a form, or if not, most likely is probably writing some coding right directly on top of the invoice. It's going to a manager for approval. By the time it gets to finance, you've already got a supplier who's reached out to the reception or maybe to finance saying, "What about the payment of these invoices?" So it's a very daunting task. So what I've described to you can be looked at as no automation, but in many situations, because there's some electronics involved, there's some technology like an Excel spreadsheet involved, some organizations will take that as being partial. The reality is when we're looking at full automation, it does start with how information is being captured. And the ideal way is to have it captured electronically. That's where the OCR example, AI and machine learning come into play to make sure that we're getting your company's coding and that we're building logic into the technology that gathers the information that is most relevant to the company. The second area of automation is looking at smart workflow. And that could be based on hierarchy of an organization. It could be based on cost object rules that you have, based on the expense that's being incurred or the invoice. It's going to a specific person. But here's where the intelligence starts to play in. For organizations that have things like POs that are initiated, if an invoice comes back and it matches the PO that has already been approved within the organization, does it really need to touch multiple people again? Or can it go directly into finance, completed, and you know the information is accurate? Or is the dollar amount so large that this particular expense or invoice needs to touch multiple people like a CFO within an organization? Having that intelligent workflow makes sure that the people who need to touch an expense report or an invoice touch them to make sure that it's accurate and flowing into finance the way that it should be. The other component is integration into existing technology. That's where the majority of the time consumption is having finance then rekey information that's been rekeyed in probably 5 or 6 times already. They're putting that information into really relevant solutions like ERPs or HCM solutions. What we're doing and what automation is doing is eliminating that manual data entry. And then lastly, a very important component to the organization is actually that automated payments back out to the vendors or to the employees. Still, too many companies today are still using manual checks, which when you're loading employees and vendors into your master file at the end of the day is just loaded for opportunities for fraud. So making sure you can automate that entire process from when the information needs to be captured to when the reimbursement needs to happen out to the vendors and to the employees is important. Now, I just want to preface there, just because I'm like Deborah, I'm a bit of a storyteller. We're not eliminating the human element of this completely. They still need to validate the information at the end of the day. Action needs to be taken on the data that's being gathered so you can do things like vendor negotiations or enhance the policies that you've got today. But the goal is to remove unnecessary human interaction so they can go focus on more strategic business activities within the company.
It sounds like, you're saving time, which means you're saving money.
Exactly.
Okay, let's go back to our attendees and audience with our next question. Do you use AI in your spend management? Yes, no, or you're just simply unsure? Deborah, I know I've asked you this in other discussions because I just find it so interesting. what has been the highest dollar value of fraud that you've seen, or you've captured, or you've helped track down and find the fraudsters?
Yeah, well, let me just tell you, if we are not using AI, we should be, because the fraudsters definitely are. And what's funny is that this AI deepfake audio fraud, which was where the fraudsters got away with $35 million, was back in 2020. And, we were in 2024, but they were using it back then. They're using it today. And that 35 million was a result of a deep fake audio fraud where a controller was called. As a matter of fact, had a personal relationship with the finance director and was still fooled by the audio and made the payment that the finance director asked them to make. So yeah, if we're not using AI, we should be, because the fraudsters definitely are.
There you go. So again, are you currently using AI to optimize spend management in your organization? Yes, with 0. I like this. This is huge numbers, guys. 94% said no, and 6% said unsure. Deborah, I'll start off with you as you know, as a certified fraud examiner. How do you see AI being using for preventing fraud? Like, I know we just kind of tapped on it, but
yeah. So as a certified fraud examiner, I belong to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and they put out a report every 2 years. And now we're going to kind of flip over to internal fraud or occupational fraud. And one of the biggest categories of internal or occupational fraud is misappropriation of assets, and included in that is expense reports. And so you can have an employee submit to be reimbursed for an expense on their expense report, yet also have that same employee submit an invoice. And so once the employee gets reimbursed, or when they are processing to get reimbursed, that invoice is also being processed. Well, it's hard for a human, to find that. But that's a great use case for AI, because they can check to see whether an invoice in the system has already been included or processed or paid via an expense report, which again is very hard to do, hard to see if you're manually entering in both of those and don't have the AI automation to connect the two. And it doesn't have to be for fraud either, right? Sometimes, an employee will pay on their corporate card for an expense, let's say a restaurant or a hotel. They'll submit their expense report to get reimbursed, but yet the restaurant or the hotel will still send an invoice, even unbeknownst to the employee, will still send an invoice to AP. And how do you find, that payment has already been made on a corporate card and being reimbursed via an expense report? Well, you do need AI for that. And I'll tell you too, that is something that we saw often when I was a practitioner in that Fortune 15 company, so much so that I, as the global accounts payable vendor manager, just stopped setting up restaurants and hotels in my vendor master file. So then if the invoices came in, they wouldn't be able to be paid. That's how big of an issue it was. But AI can totally find that now. So I think that's an important key for AI, one, to avoid potential fraud from the intentional fraudsters, and then also to reduce the spend that is in error because you paid on an expense report, but you've also paid the invoice.
Yeah. If I can add to that too, if I can just add to that, the unintentional errors, I think, is very important as well too. So if you think about the volume, let's just use the business traveler, because we're using expense reports as an example,
Yeah.
the amount of receipts that is collected by that business traveler can be quite large. And if they don't have a corporate card, many times they're both reconciling an expense report to be reimbursed by the company, but then they're hanging on to those receipts to also reconcile against their own personal credit card. And I've had personally the situation arrive where I filed an expense report, but then I had a lingering receipt hanging around in my office for a little bit. And I didn't know if I had actually expensed that before. So this was several months later. I put it onto an expense report. And again, AI and technology detected that I had put that on a previous expense report. Again, unintentional on my part. It was a small dollar amount, but I wanted to make sure that I was reimbursed that $10 for parking. And in this particular situation, again, the technology identified it. I guarantee on a manual process where I'm filling out a paper Excel spreadsheet or an Excel spreadsheet online, that no one was going to be able to detect that, and I would have been reimbursed another $10 again. And if you think about that on mass, do you know what I mean? Or just larger dollar amounts, it's pretty significant to an organization.
You know, we asked other participants about the use of AI when it came to spend management, and Canada, as you saw the earlier numbers with our attendees, Canada was 84% that they don't use AI versus 16% that they do. Like, those numbers speak volumes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, you know, there's many situations where there are individuals using technology that they don't even realize that AI is actually embedded into it.
Yeah.
You know, I just, it begs the question again, you know, what role does it play? And what benefits do you see early adopters realizing? What are some of these benefits?
Yeah, I'll love to take that. I think I said this earlier, but I'll repeat it because I think it's worth repeating. When I look at AI and just trying to break it down to its simplest form, I always say that it allows you to capture, process, and analyze large quantities of data in a short period of time. And AI, although it's a big buzzword right now, it's not necessarily new to our customers. We have a tool called Expenseit, which is OCR for capturing information off of receipts, that has been using AI for years. So, and then we just recently announced in March that we're introducing AI into some of our travel request functionality too. So when I think about spend management, it's about using a company's money wisely, right? That's how I kind of look at spend management, if we really wanted to simplify it. So let me step away from spend management, for example, and give you a real life example as to why AI is so important, or how it's beneficial. So if you look at ChatGPT, anybody can gather the information that ChatGPT does that we put in there. So we ask whatever the question is at the end of the day. Anybody can go gather that information, but the time in which it would take to gather the information to the extent at which ChatGPT can do in a very short period of time is just not worth it. That's the value of ChatGPT at the end of the day, is that it really saves a lot of time and gives you very accurate information. So if we bring the travel request into the fold, and why that's important to spend management is that a travel request is an individual saying, I'm about to take a trip, which is a very expensive endeavor for an organization to send someone on a plane somewhere. And so that's the spend management component of it. So the example I want to give you here is that a travel request traditionally would require an employee to say, all right, I'm going to Vancouver a month from now. I need to look at the dates that I'm going to travel there, and I need to see all the available flights that could get me there so I can figure out what an average cost would be, so that way I can go make a request. They would do the same process for a hotel as well. Well, AI, similar to that ChatGPT example that I gave, they can gather that information so much faster and so much more efficiently than an end user can. And it can then produce and say that trip is going to cost you on average during that time frame X amount of dollars. Now it allows the organization to make an educated decision as to whether or not it makes sense for that individual to travel. So again, we talked about time savings before, we talked about reducing errors, but really what we're doing is we're giving people back time to go do things that are more relevant, to go drive revenue for an organization, and for finance departments to be able to figure out ways to cut costs. That's really the key of what AI and other technologies can do.
Just what you said there gives them time to generate more revenue for the company. That's massive. Deborah, any final thoughts on, you know, the topic at hand today?
Yeah, I would say just keep automating right at each level. And as we saw in the research in the report, you know, the highest level or the function with the most percentage of automation was invoice management. Then you have purchase order management, expense management. Just keep going for each function and automating until you get right where all of your functions are automated. Again, may not be 100% of each function, but just keep automating each function as you can. I think that is very key to avoid fraud, to get that time back. So, you know, as great as Brian said that, I used to say to do more value added tasks, but to drive revenue sounds much better.
Especially in this day and age, everyone's looking for a little more revenue in their pocket.
Yeah.
Brian, what do you think the biggest key factor of today's discussion has been?
You know what? I think more so than anything else, it's making everybody who's on the phone right or watching us right now feel comfortable that they don't necessarily need to dive into the deep end right away. We did talk, and I was joking a little bit about full automation, 100%, not 100%. But I think it's important for them to understand every organization has a different objective, right? For some companies right now, it's driving revenue, could be reducing costs. Perhaps it's just more visibility. I love, Deborah, you brought up just employee experience. I mean, that's something that right now, I would say since the pandemic, something that has been top of mind for every organization is how do I attract talent and how do I retain talent at the end of the day? And the way to do so is to leverage technology to make their lives a little bit easier. Yeah. So in Canada, we have a tendency to not dive into the deep end. Sometimes we don't even want to put our toe into the shallow end, but they tell you before you get into the pool to take a shower. So I would say if you can turn on the shower and put your foot into the shower, I say that would be a great start for everybody, because there is a desire out there from the organizations that I speak to, from the CFOs, to bring technology into the organization. And if I can encourage, regardless of what technology it is to take that opportunity to see what is out there based on what your organization is looking to accomplish from its business outcomes.
Well, thank you, Deborah Richardson. Thank you, Brian Veloso. It's been, as always, educational. And thank you to our attendees. I guess, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of them are in Canada and we're experiencing this crazy weather. You know, it's funny, my buddy asked me just the other day what he should do if he gets rejected from a job he's going for at the sunscreen company. And I said, just reapply. I'm Rob Pagetto. Thank you for attending this wonderful webinar. It's been recorded, so if you're interested in the copy, we'll be happy to pass that on because there was a lot of great information. Deborah, Brian, a pleasure as always.
Thank you very much. Take care. Stay
Thanks.
cool.
Bye-bye.